And let me just modify this mic very quickly. All right, so welcome everyone. The agenda of this talk will be as follows. First, I'll go over an introduction very briefly, following my hypothesis derivation by methodology and data. Then I'll go over the results and the implications of these results. And so before I begin this talk, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge and dedicate this talk to my dad, Guy Nelson Corman Jr., who had passed away in March of 2017 to pancreatic cancer. Not only was he an incredible dad, but he was also even more of an incredible person, and this is for him. And so first, situating this research as part of a broader research agenda. Where does this current talk, this current study fit in with my current research paradigm? Well, this study presented here is the third article in my 3-article dissertation. Article 1 in my dissertation was titled State Capture and the Role of Political Parties in Latin America. This study examined the impact of political parties on state capture in Latin America and was published in 2022 in the Biden Journal of Public Policy. Article 2 of my dissertation is titled Assessing the Impact of Wealth Inequality on State Capture in Latin America. In this study, I examined the impact of the top 1% share of wealth inequality on state capture in Latin America. This study was published just recently in March of 2023 in the International Journal of Development Issues. And the focus of this talk today is the third article of my dissertation titled Democracy or Rule of Law, an evaluation of what really matters for state capture in Latin America, 1996 to 2021. All 3 of these pieces of research are distinct yet interconnected pieces of scholarship that help to explain the overall variation in state capture across the Latin American region. And so the main research question for this study is, what is the effect of democracy and rule of law on state capture in Latin America? And the motivation behind this study, more or less, is a multitude of contexts. For one, you may be asking, why should we care about state capture in Latin America in the first place? Or what even is state capture? And I'll get into the concept and what is state capture a little bit later, but for now, just note that you can think of state capture as a grand form of corruption, more or less. And so why should we care about it in Latin America? For one, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world across economic indicators. The haves and the have-nots in Latin America are disparaging. Wealth inequality in Latin America is some of the highest levels in both the developing and developed world. 2, Latin America, moreover, since the 1990s, has witnessed an explosion of populism and democratic erosion. State capture deteriorates democracy. It is harmful for democracy and democratic representation and an egalitarian society, moreover, in both the economic sphere and the political sphere. State capture deliberately excludes some groups, some interests, some sectors at the expense of others. So it's harmful for democracy and democratic representation. And also, the results of my prior study in Chapter 2, where I assessed the impact of wealth inequality on state capture, in that study, I had democracy as a control variable. And although democracy wasn't the focus of that study, wealth inequality was. The effect of democracy showed that it had a positive and statistically significant effect on state capture. And that made me wonder, because all of us are always told democracy is always good, democracy should be beneficial. We should, have greater representation both in the economic and political sphere. But yet I'm finding an effect that as democracy increases, we have more state capture in Latin America. So this made me want to explore this phenomena further. And there have also been studies conducted examining state capture in Latin America in relation to both rule of law and democracy. I've posted here a multitude of citations. However, many of these studies lack large-end statistical analysis that is generalizable for the region at large. For example, Berthen, 2015, finds that Latin American countries have largely consolidated the electoral component of democracy across Latin America. However, democratic governance in general remains extremely divergent across the region and can contribute towards both corruption and state capture. No quantitative evidence, importantly, was presented for these findings that can generalize for the region at large. The motivation continued. Duran 2019 also finds that weak and poor studies in his seminal book, where he theorized state capture across the Latin American region, that weak and porous democracies are susceptible to influence and capture by private economic actors. Again, this study did not present any quantitative evidence to shore up these claims. Santiso 2020 recognizes the centrality of both rule of law for democratic consolidation and its impact in combating corruption and state capture in Latin America. This study also did not present any quantitative evidence to back up these claims. Moreover, studies examining both rule of law and democracy, the key independent variables of interest in this current study, and their impact on state capture in Latin America are often unidimensional in nature, only unpacking the effect of either one or the other of these variables. We're not often examining the impact of both of these variables and their combined theoretical, conceptual, and quantitative impact on state capture. Consequently, then, a thorough analysis of both variables, rule of law and democracy, remains a thorough task to undertake in order to help explain the variation in state capture across the Latin American region for results that can help us to understand the overall regional drivers of state capture for Latin America. And so let me begin by now explaining the concept of state capture. By a show of hands here in the room, how many of you recognize these two gentlemen to the right here on the screen? Mostly everyone. Here we have President Vladimir Putin of Russia, and over here is a prominent Russian oligarch. His name is Oleg Deripaska. And Vladimir Putin in 2000 said to Oleg Deripaska and 20 other Russian oligarchs in a roundtable meeting when the Russian state was being formed as it was transitioning from communism, from the former Soviet Union into a capitalist country, a capitalist democratic country, so to say. He said this quote to these 21 leading oligarchs when the state was being formed: "I only want to draw your attention straight away to the fact that you have yourselves formed this very state, to a large extent through political and quasi-political structures under your control. So perhaps what one should do least of all is blame the mirror." And it's important to recognize the context of when Vladimir Putin told these oligarchs this back in 2000. This was a time in Russia when business power, economic power by private sector actors greatly outweighed statal power or public sector power. So private power was much more predominant and powerful in Russian society at the time relative to public power. As the state was weak, it was newly formed, and its institutions were not yet developed nor robust, so to say. And so the seminal definition of state capture derives from Hellman et al. 2000, who pioneered the concept of state capture, studying these countries in the former Soviet Union as they transitioned from communist rule to democratic capitalist rule. And a definition that is standard to this day is state capture is private sector actors systematically shaping the rules of the game of the state via their use or via the use of private payments and bribes. So we have private sector actors through illicit and obscure mechanisms systematically shaping the rules of the state. They do this through various ways. One of them is instrumental power, political power that they have. Business is always going to have a seat at the table, right? It doesn't matter if you're a labor union, a social society, or a civil society organization, so to say. None of these other groups have as much power or as much of a representative seat at the table relative to business in a capitalist democratic country. Business always has a seat at the table, especially relative to labor and labor unions. And so this definition, however, while it prioritized the power of private sector actors, the definition and the concept of state capture has since expanded to account for the role of both public sector actors and illicit actors. And so now in this more encompassing definition of state capture, we still maintain the role of private sector actors, and they are predominant, and they are always playing a key role in state capture. However, In the new definition and concept of state capture of how we interpret it today, it's not always led by private sector actors. Sometimes state capture in this cases can be led by public sector actors, where government officials are the leading capture actors, coordinating and in collusion with the private sector, but it's public sector led. For illicit actors, the most prominent example is what we see witnessing in Latin America today. Drug cartels, predominantly originating in Mexico and Colombia, have expanded their foot presence and their foothold across the region at large. They're even operating in Chile and Argentina and Uruguay right now, countries that have historically been more or less immune from much of the drug trafficking taking place across the region. And so you may ask, well, how does this differ from corruption, right? I mean, we have private sector actors trying to bribe public officials and public officials in collusion with private sector actors, you know, oftentimes giving bribes, giving money, giving donation. What's the difference from this term for corruption? It's a valid question. Well, let me explain first that there are three phases of governance. The first phase in governance is formulation, where the rules of the game, the rules of the state, the political and economic sphere are being formulated. Lawmakers are writing them, they're consulting with the public opinion, industry is having input on these various laws that dictate economic and political relations. This is the formulation phase. The second phase of the governance process is the implementation phase. We move beyond formulation. The laws have already been written. Now they're being implemented. They're being enforced. These are our bureaucratic agencies. These are our police. These are enforcing speeding tickets, etc. We're enforcing the laws that are written. And the final stage in the governance process is systems of accountability, such as the courts and other independent actors, such as watchdog groups, that act as a check, more or less, to verify and to make sure that the laws that have been formulated and that are being implemented are not being abused or being used as an arbitrary and discretionary tool to target certain people, so to say, or certain sectors of society. And so corruption in this sense, within these three phases of governance, it often focuses on the implementation of the rules of the game. For instance, bribing a police officer to get out of a speeding ticket. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you have bribed a police officer before in this room? All right, I'm noting this, everyone. All right, and so the rules of the game in this example, think about it. You bribed a police officer to get out of a speeding ticket. In this case, we know the speed. I'm driving down Ann Arbor Road to get here to the University of Michigan. I need to go 60 miles an hour, no less, no more. If I'm going 80 miles an hour and a police officer pulls me over, he's writing me up for a ticket. The laws have already been made. The speed limit is set. I broke the law. State capture, however, focuses on the formulation of the rules of the game. And so an example of this is, for instance, a wealthy business tycoon bribing high-ranking officials to pass favorable laws that benefited his companies while undermining fair competition in the market. And so think about that example and how this is the stage where the rules are being made for the political economic sphere, right? So that corruption example with the police officer and bribing him, this is already a rule that's been implemented, a law that's been implemented. Here, we're focused on the formulation. This businessman is systematically shaping the rules of the game in his favor. It happened at a different phase of the governance process. And so what I want you to take away from this is notice the time horizon differences between these two examples. Corruption in this example and other instances of corruption is short-term and has a short-term time horizon. It's often focused on one-time transactions. If I get pulled over for going 80 and it's in a 60 and I bribe that police officer $100 and he lets me go, that's a one-time transaction. I'm not harming society at large. I'm not harming, the state of Michigan at large. I'm not depriving them of any revenue necessarily. Yeah, maybe the city had lost out on $100 from a speeding ticket, but it's not affecting everyone else in their interests. It's just a one-time transaction. State capture, however, has a much longer-term time horizon, and it's often focused and related to forming long and collusive relationships with public sector officials over time. And I'll go back to that instance where I said in the beginning, business always has a seat at the table. They have a seat at the table in consultation with the government for a reason. And so I derived several hypotheses and test them in this study. One is democracy should increase state capture in Latin America by and large, as most democracies in the region are weak and porous, making them vulnerable to private influence. A second hypothesis I study is rule of law should decrease state capture, as a strong rule of law is paramount to exercise the law in a non-arbitrary manner free from undue influence. A third hypothesis estimated is an interaction hypothesis, where I hypothesize that the impact of rule of law on controlling state capture deteriorates in effectiveness as the level of democracy deteriorates. This paper also estimates a series of hypotheses H4 through H7, all of which assess different hypotheses relating to the random effects within between regression model to explore different dimensions of within and between variation for these key independent variables and their effect on state capture. But the focus of this presentation will be these three hypotheses here. And so the methodology and data that I use for this study. For one, it assesses 19 different Latin American countries. So the sample is representative and generalizable about Latin American region at large. I have a total number of observations of 418, where I have a time period under study of 1996 to 2021. My dependent variable equals state capture. I include 7 different control variables. For democracy and rule of law, the key independent variables of interest, I estimate 4 different models, and I have 2 different controls for each of these variables that I estimate in order to ensure the robustness and the validity of the results. Also, we have a democracy times rule of law interaction term. The other controls entail economic freedom, GDP per capita, growth annual percent, wealth inequality percent, and urban population percent. The model used is a random effects regression model, and this model tests the baseline effects with and without interaction. I also then estimate a random effects within between regression model to test different dimensions of variation for our key independent variables of interest. The data, you may think, where did this data come from? Well, in summer of 2022, I was awarded the summer doctoral fellowship at my host institution, University of Delaware. That opportunity gave me the opportunity throughout that summer to curate and collect this data. And what I did was I collected over 120 different variables across 9 different sources using Python, and I wrangled all of these variables and this data together across, and each of these variables has data from 1996 to 2021, and overall one large encompassing data set. So you can imagine the time it took me to do this. It took me about 2 weeks straight, to be completely honest with you. I was working on it night and day. And so the data used is a novel curated data set in this research. Now, how do we operationalize state capture, the dependent variable in this study? Well, for one, state capture, corruption, these are obscure phenomena, right? It's difficult to measure a phenomenon or a concept that is often obscure and taking place behind closed doors. If I'm bribing a government official, I don't want that government official, or I don't want other government officials to know from the opposition party. They're going to push it to the press. More or less, I don't want the public to know either. I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to be breaking the laws, right? So these phenomena take place behind closed doors. It's inherently difficult to measure. But in general, for both corruption and state capture, we have perception-based measures and expert-based measures. Both measures have their flaws and can always be argued to have some level of subjectivity or nuance to them. However, the Control of Corruption Index from the World Bank offers the most comprehensive measure of state capture available to date. It takes into account not only public sector acts of corruption and expert-led methodologies, but it also takes into account the perception that private sector actors have engaged in acts of state capture. Moreover, this same variable has been used to operationalize state capture in a multitude of studies, of which I highlight here. And thus, it is well established in the extant literature to operationalize as my dependent variable. And this variable is originally scaled from -2.5 to 2.5, with state capture assessed from going greatest to least. I invert this measure, so I flip the sign and I add 2.5 to every single observation to put it on a scale from 0 to 5 that now measures least to greatest state capture to help with interpretability of the overall effect. How do I operationalize rule of law and democracy, the key independent variables in this study? For rule of law, I mentioned I have two variables I test for each of these variables. The first variable I assess, measure 1, comes from the variety of democracy data set. And I employ the V2X rule variable specifically, which is a 0 to 1 scaled variable, continuous in nature, and it's an expert-based measure. The second variable I use to assess rule of law's impact on state capture to ensure the robustness of the original effect comes from the World Bank, and that specific indicator is WGI rule of law. And this measure goes from -2.5 through 2.5, least to greatest rule of law, the weakest rule of law to the strongest rule of law. For democracy, the first measure I use to assess its impact on state capture also derives from the varieties of democracy data set. I employ the V2X polyarchy variable specifically. It's a baseline measure of democracy, and it pretty much only assesses and looks at or considers the minimal definitions of democracy, free and fair elections, and nothing more, nothing less, so to say. It's a baseline effect of democracy. This is also a 0 to 1 scaled variable, continuous in nature. It's also an expert-based measure. The second variable that I use to also test democracy comes from Freedom House and their political rights score. And this variable is 1 to 7, greatest to least. So 1 is the greatest, the highest levels of democracy, a very strong democracy, whereas 7 is the weakest level of democracy, or you can think of 7 as being a downright authoritarian country. And that is a continuous variable that scales from 1 to 7. And so here's just a brief look at the descriptive statistics of these key variables. And I just want to go over the averages real quick. So remember, state capture, it ranges from 0 to 5. So we see here in Latin America, the average level of state capture to begin with is about 2.8, suggesting to us we already have, a moderate to high degree of state capture in the region. For rule of law, this is a 0 to 1 variable. And so this suggests here from varieties of democracy, rule of law is, not really weak, but not too strong, just moderate, right, in Latin America. The second measure, however, shows that rule of law is pretty weak in Latin America, because recall that this measure from the World Bank goes from -2.5 to 2.5. So this suggests to us that rule of law is weaker in Latin America relative to being stronger. For democracy, this effect here for varieties of democracy for the average across our 19 Latin American countries suggests to us on a 0 to 1 scale of a value of 0.64, the region in general is fairly strongly democratic. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these are strong democracies. And this is going to be important later on. And here for democracy for Freedom House, recall that this variable is scaled from 1 to 7. And so 1 is the greatest, the highest levels of democracy. So this suggests to us from Freedom House as well that in general, the region is fairly strongly democratic. We have a good bit of democratic representation and strength throughout the region. And so let's look at the results. First, for the base effects for the random effects regression model. And I just want to highlight here first, this table presents the effects or the results with no interaction. And then this table over here presents the effects for the interaction term included in the model. And in yellow, don't worry about the yellow highlight here. I've only highlighted these in yellow to distinguish for the audience the fact that both of these models have the two controls for rule of law and democracy, respectively, from varieties of democracy data set. Whereas the ones highlighted in non-yellow derived from rule of law World Bank and democracy from the Freedom House, respectively. And this is the same as well for when I present the random effects within between regression results. And so just a quick highlight of these results in general. Notice here for our independent variable rule of law, we have a consistent, strong, and highly statistically significant negative effect on state capture, suggesting to us that by and large, rule of law matters a great deal for controlling and for decreasing state capture across the Latin American region. But if you look here at the results for democracy, we have no statistically significant effect. And so it doesn't really tell us much going on there. And then the effect I wanted to highlight here in the interaction term is, although our interaction is not statistically significant for the model that uses varieties of democracy data, both rule of law and democracy from there, this effect is statistically significant when I use the different model for rule of law from the World Bank and democracy from Freedom House. And it suggests a positive effect to this coefficient on state capture. But as with any interaction term, it's not best to interpret the results of these effects from their coefficient estimates at hand. Rather, I now turn to an interaction plot to explain this finding in greater depth. And so here, I present the average marginal effect of rule of law on state capture as democracy varies. I created this by hand in Python. And what you see here on the x-axis down here is democracy. So we have Freedom House's measure of democracy going from 1 to 7. Remember, the highest level of democracy, and 7 is the worst level of democracy, or an authoritarian country you can think of. And here we have the marginal effect of rule of law on state capture. And so this blue line is the overall effect. These two black lines are the 95% confidence intervals surrounding that effect. And how we would interpret this is, at its baseline, at a strong level of democracy, rule of law does a pretty well job at controlling state capture. But we see that as democracy deteriorates, as democracy moves from 1, which is a really good, really strong democracy, down to 7 along here on this x-axis, which suggests to us a weak or an authoritarian country, that as democracy deteriorates, the effect of rule of law on state capture in controlling state capture declines in effectiveness, up to a point where we reach a level of about 5 of democracy, which could probably be thought of as a hybrid country, not fully democratic anymore, but mixture of democracy and authoritarianism. Once we reach a level of 5 of democracy, where we're getting into weak levels of democracy, the effect of rule of law on controlling state capture at that point is effectively nullified and ceases to have an impact. So the moral of the story, or the take home, the takeaway from this finding is, yes, rule of law is so important for controlling and combating state capture in Latin America. However, even rule of law ceases to be important in its effectiveness at controlling state capture in Latin America once democracy more or less goes away. So, reality, we need to have a strong rule of law and a strong democracy in order to combat state capture in Latin America. And now I present the results for the random effects within between regression model. And so, notice here, just in general, the between effect for both democracy and rule of law is much larger and greater in magnitude relative to the within effect. And so on average, and for the results for democracy, they were mixed. So for the democracy variable from VDEM, the varieties of democracy data set, it shows a positive effect, right? Where democracy does increase state capture. And how we would interpret this would be, on average, across our 19 Latin American countries, democracy increases state capture by nearly 2.02 units. And that effect was statistically significant at the p is less than 0.10 level, while controlling for all other predictors. However, when you look at the effect for democracy from Freedom House, and recall, this measure is scaled from 1 to 7, where we're going from greatest to least democracy. We have a negative effect here. And so these results here are kind of mixed, right? One is telling us democracy increases state capture. One is telling us democracy decreases state capture. And so the results for democracy remain inconclusive from this work. However, the results for rule of law between country group variation, are highly statistically significant across both measures of rule of law, from varieties of democracy data set and from the rule of law from the World Bank down here. Suggesting to us, I'll interpret from the varieties of democracy data set, on average, rule of law across our 19 different Latin American countries decreases state capture by 3.10 units. And so rule of law is critically important, especially the variation between our country level groups. Rule of law is also important when analyzing these countries, these 19 Latin American countries, in a fixed individual manner, which this within effect achieves from this random effects within between regression model. However, notice though that the magnitude of that effect is certainly not as strong as the between effect for rule of law. And most likely this is a result of the fact that, for one, we do have a couple strong countries in Latin America that have a high rule of law, such as Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. And these countries, because of their strength of rule of law, may pull the regional average upwards, contributing towards that larger effect for the between effect. Another case, and certainly another plausibility, is the fact that, in general, most countries in Latin America do have a weak rule of law. And when we analyze them in a fixed individual manner, it's going to be have negative consequences for state capture, so to say. All right, and a discussion of the results. So as we have just seen, the results for democracy were mixed. The results for the rule of law, however, were conclusive in both the base effects and in the random effect within between regression model, suggesting to us that rule of law has a strong negative effect on state capture. And the results for the interaction term, moreover, that assessed H3 tested were confirmed. And so we did find evidence that the impact of rule of law on controlling state capture deteriorates in effectiveness as democracy deteriorates. And the implications and contributions of this study. For one, this study entails a methodological contribution. It was the first study to assess the impact of both of the key independent variables, both rule of law and democracy, in a quantitative manner on state capture for the Latin American region, and to test an interaction term for them, moreover, for their effects on state capture. It's also the first study to present a random effects within between model assessing the impact of the predictors on state capture, looking explicitly at different dimensions of variation, aside from just the base effect. And finally, the final implication and contribution of this study is I have provided a theoretical conceptualization in the manuscript as to how different dimensions of variation may ultimately impact state capture for our key independent variables of interest, both rule of law and democracy. And that concludes this talk today. Thank you so much. I welcome your questions and comments.
We have one question coming to us from the Q&A in the Zoom webinar. And the question is, were you observing or intending to make connections between Vladimir Putin's rise and policies and the rise of drug trafficking in the Latin American region? Were you drawing a connection from the one to the other?
No connection drawn.
Okay, I don't think it was a threat. I think it was just a question.
Hi, James. Thanks so much. This is a really interesting project. It's really timely, really important for a lot of different policy outcomes as well as academic debates. So I just wanted to say thanks for a great talk, and I appreciated hearing about your work. I have like 6 questions for you, but I'm just going to give you one right now. Which is, I was wondering, so state capture and kind of rent seeking generally doesn't just happen in political institutions. It can happen in different industries in the economy too. So I was wondering if you could comment or maybe elaborate a little bit more on your GDP variable and what role you see that as playing in kind of driving the incentives for state capture. And then sort of connecting it to the methods, why did you decide to operationalize that sort of as % annual growth rather than like real dollar terms, for example? So yeah, but thank you.
All right. Yes, thank you so much for your question. And pertaining to that variable, GDP per capita growth percentage, the rationale I included this control variable specifically derived from the seminal work of Thomas Piketty. And Thomas Piketty is a scholar who is very famous, a political economist who wrote a great deal about poverty and wealth inequality throughout the world. And in his work on capital, he had theorized that as countries become stagnant, as they quit growing, their economies quit growing, so to say, and growth rates come to a halt. You know, we're talking about countries with a less than 1% growth rate, or 1.2 or less. That at that point, that is signaling that wealth has stagnated, so to say. Wealth is not moving hands from one emerging group of entrepreneurs or a sector in society to another. Rather, wealth is stagnated. There's not new industry, there's not new production, so to say. And so the more that wealth stagnates, the more that the economy converts and turns into a rentier-like economy at that point, where we're not creating or we're not providing any new value for society at large. Rather, we're just deriving from existing value from things. The more that capture is able to take place, because at this point now, you have these powerful actors that control this wealth, and they're only controlling more and more wealth now. And because of their predominant power and their economic clout and power is growing, they have the ability to influence the state to a much greater extent than otherwise would be the case if an economy was growing at a healthy percent for its GDP per capita overall. And we're talking in the range probably a baseline 3% growth rate, so to say. And so that's why I included that control in this study. It was included also in study 2, where I assessed the impact of wealth inequality on state capture. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So I have a couple of questions or maybe comments, I don't know. First of all, when you talk about your dependent variable, the World Bank indicator is I think is control of corruption. Just to clarify, you're dividing the indicator. I mean, the indicator includes both petty corruption and state capture, and you're dividing that, or it's just a global World Bank indicator that you're using. And my next is more like a comment. I am from Peru, so I cannot, like, your presentation speaks a lot. I think, yeah, it's true. Like, we really have big problems in terms of rule of law, state capture, right? I also think that something interesting to think about, maybe for your future projects, is also the concentration of media. No, I mean, there's a close relationship between those groups of power and how they manage to capture the state, and also how they manage to control that capturing through the media, right? And in the case of Peru, I think 80% of the media is owned by only two owners. So that's interesting. And the other thing is, what do you think about the US? I mean, I think here in the US, what I've come to learn in my time here is that there's also a lot of lobbying. Sometimes it's more formalized, but there's also a lot of private interest that blocks down some sort of policies that maybe can have support by the public, but they are not going through because it's basically blocked by Congress and Senate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. And your name?
Ignacio.
Ignacio. All right. So to begin with the first question pertaining to the dependent variable state capture. Yes, you are correct. That measure does encompass both perceptions and expert-based measures and different ways that they include these assessments in its overall construction of the measure. So it is correct to say that I do lump all of them into one category by and large by just estimating the variable as is. But once more, I as the researcher, or moreover, researchers in general, we all have to make choices, methodological choices. And this is a variable that has been operationalized to study and estimate state capture in a multitude of countries and contexts. And so I stand by this choice as the measure used to operationalize the dependent variable. Pertaining to the concentration of media and groups, yes, and in Peru, you mentioned you were Peru, and so I have no doubt that you are very familiar with state capture. I've read a lot about Peru. My advisor is actually from Peru, and I know very well the Odebrecht case in Peru. And, you know, Vladimir Montesinos, back at that time as well, you mentioned about the media, when Fujimori was in office. And Fujimori, as you know, was a corrupt president in Peru in the 1990s. He turned the state into an authoritarian dictatorship. And you mentioned the media. One thing Vladimir Montesinos did, Fujimori's right-hand man, is he bribed the media. And by controlling the media and the narrative, they were able to continue this corruption and capture ring going on in Peru until the videos of all those bribes came out in the public in early 2000. So I completely agree with you. Studying the concentration of media and media ownership in general is a very big and also important part of capture as well. And there actually have been studies of media capture in Latin America. And I can follow up with you via email if you'd be interested in those studies. And your final question is, what do I think about the USA? Where are we heading? Are we suffering from state capture here in our country? You know, it's honestly anyone's guess. The US, there's no doubt about it. We are a very strong, a great country with great institutions. We're not a perfect country though, and every country has its flaws. Unfortunately, there's loopholes and there's penetrations that can take place where these private sector actors, these oligarchs, can and do skew the rules of the game in their favor. And where are we heading now? Well, it's to be determined. I think it's too early at this point because there's so much toss-up in the air. The economic sphere in the United States, however, I believe, and I strongly stand by the fact that this is the greatest economy in the world. We have a dynamic group of entrepreneurs in this country. And as much capture and as much wealth inequality as there is in this country, and there's still an ability to overcome capture, and there's opportunity in this country. And state capture certainly is not as dangerous nor pernicious here in this country as it is relative to some of the other developed democracies, such as even the United Kingdom, which in my opinion suffers from a lot more state capture relative to what we have here in the US.
So we could end on that provocative note. I think that's an invitation to more study. Actually, we do have a couple of minutes, and I'll take Chair's prerogative to. Could you tell us a little bit more methodologically about the random effects between within model that you used? Describe the model for us a bit, in case and how it works.
All right, thank you for that question, Rob. And so the random effects within between model. How I did this was first for getting the within effect. I took the group level averages. So I had 19 different Latin American countries, and I got their group level averages each for state capture and for every other variable in that sense, or every other control in that sense, not for state capture, but for my controls. And once I got the group level average across its time period, I subtracted that group level average from the individual level observation for each of my 7 control variables in that study. And this enabled me to get the within effect. And essentially the within effect is a fixed effect without all of the downfalls of a traditional fixed effects model. Whereas we can estimate it still in the context of a random effects regression model that is generalizable for us and our results at large. And the between effect, I got that by taking the overall country level group averages and did not subtract them from their overall group or individual level observations for the variables at hand. Rather, we have a series of 25 years in this data set. And so the between effect entails the average level of each of the control variables across those 25 years. And that enabled me to estimate the between effect. And from that, I was able to construct the random effects within between model. And so it only estimated both within and between variation, whereas the base effects were estimated within the traditional random effects model.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, it's very rude to ask a question when you're late to a talk. Sorry, we finished class, and by the time I got here, I missed most of your talk. But I was wondering, so a very interesting project. I know a little bit about it, and I was wondering if you have all these years of observations for all of these countries, could you estimate the effect of regime change? Let's say Fujimori goes away. right? Would you be able to consider that like little bits of changes in the rule of law or in the levels of democracy on state capture, and then consider those changes as a continuous treatment on this? So could you make a causal claim that any changes in democracy or in rule of law actually cause a reduction in state capture? Or you think that would be going too far? Because this is a very selfish question. I've been replicating a lot of political science non-causal claims, and the moment you bring them into like a difference and differences framework, then none of those claims hold, because when you actually look at like gradual changes in these, you don't see them causing an effect in our outcome of interest. But I was wondering if such a thing was possible within the data frame that you have. And this is just like a maybe exploratory question for what could come next. Thanks.
And so I'm going to ask you, Sally, to just break down your question in more or less one sentence then, just to clarify the exact point.
Right. So the association that you find between these two independent variables and your outcome variable, would you be able to make a causal claim in terms of changes in regime or major changes in the central government in these countries and their impact on state capture?
Thank you so much for that question. That's a great question. And I actually can answer that question with respect to another study I've conducted that's currently under review with my advisor at the European Review of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And in this study, we actually estimate this exact phenomenon you've described, where we estimate regime changes, specifically in the context of populism and democracy and their impact on state capture. And so we have hand-coded from 1996 to 2021, every single year for across our 19 Latin American countries, where we have a populist president in power. And it's coded as a 1, so that effect is turned on. And 0 otherwise when a populist is not in power, or of course that would signify as well a regime change in that continuous column of data, so to say. And we actually did find in that work as well that populism relative to no populism has a greater effect on increasing state capture. So populism is very pernicious for state capture, at least in the Latin American context. I can't speak for other regions of the world because our study only focused on Latin America.
Maybe such as the United States, another call for an investigation into current contexts here. Well, let's everybody thank James again. Thanks.